Well, good morning, guys. And it is a good morning, though it's a fairly early morning. I'm delighted to have you here joining us as we start this series called Great Questions, which is a series that I think will introduce you to some questions that you have already asked. These are questions that pass through our minds from time to time, but because of the size and complexity of the subject matter, oftentimes we don't find what I think is a satisfying answer that we can land on and get our hands on. And hopefully we can change that, because we're going to tackle 6 great questions over the next 6 weeks, starting with this first one, which is kind of a biggie, and that is, how on earth did we get here? You guys ready for the ride for that? How on earth did we get here? And we're talking about on this planet Earth. You know, for Christians, and I'm going to assume most of us are of the Christian faith, there may be some guys here who are still seekers, and so this is just a place for you to come and kind of think about the Christian viewpoint on this particular subject. But as Christians, oftentimes, we just have a quick, easy answer. Well, God put us here on earth in 6 days. End of story, right? That's kind of the traditional view. But as you know, we don't live in a Christian age, we live in a post-Christian age, and that viewpoint of God putting us here is constantly being challenged. And it's constantly being undermined by a secular world, and we face all these new theories and new scientific discoveries, and it creates all kind of fog and confusion in our minds concerning our faith and what our faith teaches. And at some places in the Bible, we come kind of headlong into controversy between what the Bible says and what our world is saying. And it creates what I say is a great question. For instance, some of you from time to time will see on your iPhone, or if you're an old guy like me, maybe in your newspaper, but you come across articles that kind of want to draw you in, and you might just read a headline or you might go further. But here's one that came up recently where it says, Skull supports idea multiple species of humans once coexisted. And so you read that. Now, for some of us, we might just casually dismiss that. That's way above me. I don't really know what that really means for me or pertains to my life or whatever. But the question is, when you see something like that, what do you think? And then if you just read just a little bit of what it says, and I'll read just the opening paragraph, it says, a €2 million skull from East Africa has shored up claims, that is, brought proof, that at least 3 species of early humans once coexisted in an evolutionary experiment in stew that saw an increase in brain size paired with different faces and teeth and jaw. Now, when you read that, do you just skeptically dismiss it and say, listen, I didn't come from some ape-like creature? But if you see enough of those things constantly being paraded before you, do you ever just wonder? Do you ever just wonder for just a moment, is that me? Is that me? Is that how I got here? From generations of evolution and genetic mutation? And then you open your Bible and you read about God creating the heavens and the earth, and you look at it and you go, is that me? Is that how I got here? It's a great question, isn't it? And it's one that we're going to tackle this morning, and you need to hang on because we got a lot of information that we're going to cover. But we're going to tackle that question, and we're going to start with another question, your kind of personal take on what you believe about Genesis 1 and 2. And so I'm going to give you some options, and you can decide, where do I fit on these options as we walk through different perspectives on those chapters, because there are different perspectives. So for instance, when you read Genesis 1 and 2, do you just take it simply as literally true? That is, that the heavens and the earth were created in 6 literal days by God, and then there was a 7th day of rest? Or would you lean more to, it's just a literary story? When it says days, it doesn't mean literal days. Those days are figuratively representing ages, not 24-hour days, but ages of God's creative process. Or maybe you take it to be a literary story, a mixture of truth and fiction. It's kind of concocted in order to help primitive people explain how the universe and human life began. Or maybe you go even further to the left and you think it's just simply a literary myth. It's a purely imaginary story to explain what really is unknowable. It's just unknowable. Nobody's going to really be able to figure it out. Or maybe you just kind of throw up your hands in light of the world in which we live and you go, I'm just not sure. Honestly, I'm not sure. I don't know enough about this subject to have a strong belief one way or the other. And hopefully I'm going to give you some options where you can begin to build a framework in a modern world about deep philosophical truth that will help you move forward in this great question rather than just feel neutralized by it, which is what most people feel when they come upon a great question like this. We're going to start with a perspective from Scripture, though, that kind of humbles us. It's from Solomon in Ecclesiastes. He says, God has made everything appropriate in its time. He has also set eternity in man's heart. We know there's something bigger than ourselves, but God has set it there yet so that man will not find out the work which God has done. I love this, from the beginning even to the end. In other words, what Solomon is saying, no matter how much we know, there's still going to be some mystery at the beginning and the end. There's going to be some guesswork. So we're not going to be able to nail this thing down as absolute fact one way or the other. But what we can do this morning, and what I hope to do this morning, is move you past the surface of this question to a little bit deeper framework where it can begin to help you understand where the solid ground is and build a personal case for yourself. So, knowing that there's still some mystery there, here's what I believe, and everybody look at me on this point, here's what I believe are the four primary answers to how on earth we got here. Here's the first, and it's one that dominates secular culture. It's natural evolution, which was birthed by Charles Darwin, and it has some certain assumptions. First, it assumes a purely material universe. Secondly, it requires billions of years. And third, it's built on random chance. You mix those three things together, and the case you get is that man just randomly and earth randomly came together in this cosmological accident. And here we are. Second is theistic evolution, a relatively new theory that's very popular today because it combines natural evolution, this long process of the development of human life, with periodic interventions of God to shape and direct it. God's got a system set up, but every once in a while He steps into it to kind of manage it. Theistic evolution, by the way, is increasingly the view of many Christian scientists and even theologians. In fact, just a few years ago, they did a poll and found that 66% of all Christian scientists are natural evolutionists or theistic evolutionists. And among them is a name that you might star because it's in your notes, Francis Collins. Francis Collins is an evangelical that would fit great in the Little Rock community, but Francis Collins is noted because he is the one who cracked the genetic code. Okay? So everybody in the scientific community knows and admires Francis Collins. But because of his faith, he has wrestled with how to put what he knows about genetics with what he believes about the Bible. And he's got a website that has invited theologians and scientists to come and discuss his views and offer their views. And the website is there in your outline, BioLogos. You might just note that, and you might even sample it this week. But Collins believes that man has evolved and then been endowed at some place in his development with a divine image. He doesn't believe in a literal Adam and Eve. And because of that, it's been quite controversial. But it has invited and even won some major theologians in America today to his particular viewpoint. The third is one that most church-going conservative Christians would embrace, and that is a literal Genesis creation. And that is, in 6 24-hour days, God created everything. He created everything. And by the way, that's not just the viewpoint of some narrow conservative theologians. There are a lot of prominent scientists who have surprised me in their embrace of a 6 literal day creation. And again, there's a website I gave you, answersingenesis.com, that you can go and sample major addresses by some prominent scientists on their belief in this particular viewpoint. There's also a major film that came out this year entitled Is Genesis History? Got to go to see that movie. By the way, it was packed out. It surprised people because it was packed out all around the country and was produced by a person in Little Rock, Thomas Purefoy, and had prominent scientists and theologians who were contributing their viewpoints about how on earth we got here. And so you might check that out at Amazon.com. And then finally, the fourth viewpoint is the day-age Genesis creation. And that is that the days of Genesis are not considered literal, but they're considered figurative for ages of unspecified length. Different lengths of time. Now this is very important. You might star this. These ages in the day-age theory were under God's sovereign creative hand, and no creature, including man, evolved. Not in the day-age Genesis viewpoint. All were directly created by God over vast periods of time. Now that's a lot of information dumped on you in just one thing. We're gonna picture that. Sometimes I'm helped more by pictures. So what we want to do is put up each one of these viewpoints and kind of let you feel how they developed historically using this colored diagram. So let's look at the evolutionary view first of all. And it starts out with, of course, the Big Bang. Okay, the Big Bang that scientists document around 13.75 billion years ago. And if you ask a scientist what caused the Big Bang, they don't know. If you ask Stephen Hawking, the great astrophysicist, what brought the Big Bang about, he has no idea. But that is the prevailing view, that this universe started in a microdot that then exploded to create our vast universe. And then over time, as that universe developed, Earth was born at 4.5 billion years ago. How do we know that? Well, we know that by dating rocks through radiometric dating. By the way, when they went to the moon, when Apollo went to the moon and picked up moon rocks, and they came back and they dated those moon rocks and compared them to Earth rocks, they dated exactly the same. Which means Earth and moon had some kind of mutual birth in the cosmos. And then life began to form. And over time, as it formed from small to great. We had the great age of the dinosaurs about 230 million years ago, and then they passed away about 65 million years ago. And then in the evolutionary view, man appeared, or man-like creatures. They were moving from ape to some middle ground between modern man and ape-like creatures about 2.5 million years ago. And they began to develop, and they even sprung ancestors off of that tree, according to the evolutionary view, and this race of beings called Neanderthals appeared. Different from humans, but they, at least with the things they found, acted a little bit like humans, and they built altars and buried their dead and those kind of things. And they appeared and flourished about 200,000 BC, and then suddenly disappeared at 30,000 BC. Then as man and Neanderthals moved out into the world from Africa, there was a giant volcanic explosion about 70,000 BC that then initiated the Ice Age, and man had to regress, almost wiped what of these man-like creatures were on the earth completely out to extinction, but they regressed back into southern Africa and stayed there for a while. And then at about 50,000 BC, according to the evolutionary view, suddenly man reemerges out of Africa and begins to move into the Middle East and Asia and Europe, but he was vastly different. Now look at me, guys. He was vastly different. And nobody knows why, but he was no longer this middle link, but he was thinking man. He was a man who could plan and organize and have community and worship. And his eyes were brightened with an intellect that had never been seen before. And then that led to hunting, and then ultimately to farming, and then to communities. And then the first civilization began to develop in the Fertile Crescent in Mesopotamia, what we call Iraq today, Babylonia back then, at about 3500 BC, and the first great civilization developed. And then we come kind of to our Bible. Because when you open the Bible and you get to Genesis 12 and you're introduced to a guy named Abraham, he gets called out of that Fertile Crescent, that first civilization in a city called Ur, where he was a businessman, and he's called to go out and start a new nation in a new area that God didn't even tell him where it was. He just said, I want you to follow me. And that was the beginning of Abraham's trek into what we now know as Israel or Palestine. And then we'll pick up that story later. But that's the evolutionary view. Now let's compare that evolutionary view to the theistic evolutionary view. The theistic evolutionary view, we're going to skip all these things in that we just covered, but the theistic evolutionary view would adopt all this and just bring it down. Say this is exactly the same way that it happened. And so with evolution being there, it then led to this humanoid that about 50,000 BC, as I told you, emerged from Africa, but no longer as this missing link, but suddenly this humanoid that was fully human, meaning that he had this new consciousness, he had these new intellectual and mental capacities and new spiritual capacities. He wasn't just a thinking man, he was a worshiping man. And at least from a theistic evolutionary view, either he evolved into that new spiritual state, or he was injected at that moment by God intervening in history to this evolved man, and he was given the image of God. And suddenly he was us. He was us in that viewpoint. And then the first civilization, and then we go to Abraham leaving Ur, and we got the Bible starting in Genesis 12 with the journey of Abraham to create the great nation of Israel. Then the literal Genesis, and now if you're ever driving in a car and something comes out in front of you and you have to jam on the brake and you just suddenly get jolted, if you go from these two to this third one, you feel that kind of shock. Because we go from the Big Bang and 13.75 billion years ago to literal Genesis, and you've got the universe and the earth and man created, but look at the date. Between 8,000 and 4,000 BC. I just want to let you see it as a picture. So in other words, 10,000 years ago, everything started with God's Big Bang according to the literal Genesis viewpoint, whereas in the other two viewpoints, 13.75 billion years ago. You guys feel that? Everybody look at it. Do you feel that? That is vastly different, isn't it? And then somewhere in this process, Adam and Eve are created, they move along, then the human race is almost wiped out in Noah's flood. I'm not putting a date on that because I don't know where that would be in that process, but you got Noah's flood, and civilization has to recreate itself through Noah's family line, and then you come after man populates and settles down to the first civilization, and then Abraham again. Just want you to feel those timelines. And then the last one, the day-age Genesis viewpoint. And it goes back to the Big Bang. And then you have what I call 6 day ages of unspecified length. Some could be vastly longer than others, but as you read through the Genesis account of each day, the first day, the second day, the third day, as God's developing land masses and then animal life and plant life, some of those could be billions of years or hundreds of millions of years, we don't know. But the day-age viewpoint would be their unspecified periods of time. And then as life develops and matures and gets more sophisticated, somewhere between 50,000 BC and 8,000 BC, Adam and Eve are, and here's the key word, are directly created by God. In this long period of time, there's no evolution going on. There's not a simplistic organism emerging to a more complex organism, those organisms and those plant life, those plants and then animals and then ultimately man, at every stage along the way, they're directly created by God. They don't evolve into what they are. They just become what they are as God speaks them into existence. So the plants and animals do not evolve. Neither does man. And in this viewpoint, there's a literal Adam and Eve, first couple, starting the human race. And then we go from there, and somewhere in there is Noah's flood, then the first civilization, then Abraham leaves Ur in the Fertile Crescent, and the story of the nation of Israel begins in Genesis 12. Now, look at your notes for just a second, kind of absorb some of that, fill in some of your outline as I race through that, but I race through it because I just want you to see the picture. The thing is not to master all the details, but to feel the timelines. Because when you're dealing with great questions, when you pick up something like I did just a moment ago in that newspaper article, and it says that they found these 3 humanoids, ape-like creatures, some bones of them 2 million years ago, you can look on this and you go, okay, here's where they're talking about. That's an evolutionary perspective. Here's where we are, okay? If indeed those things do represent man. On the other hand, maybe they're just ancient creatures that came and passed on the scene, but I'm still sticking with a literal Adam and Eve, okay? But I want you to feel those timelines as they're laid out before you, because those are the 4 primary viewpoints that exist in our world today that have some credibility when you're asking the great question, how on earth did we get here? Okay, now we're going to drill down on some specifics of that information. And so I've got 7 what I call key creation questions, and we're just going to give a little more detail to what we just talked about with these 7 questions. So letter A on your outline, is our earth young or old? How would we answer that? Well, you felt that in that diagram because young means that the earth is only about 10,000 years old in the literal Genesis creation viewpoint. Old, on the other hand, is that the earth is 4.5 billion years old in the evolutionary, theistic evolutionary, and day-age theory. And there's a big difference between the two. You know, for hundreds of years, through the Roman Empire into the Middle Ages and almost up until the beginning of the 20th century, this question was not prominent. People just adopted a biblical viewpoint. And the biblical viewpoint that they held on to as far as dating came actually, I've got it in your notes, from an archbishop, James Ussher, who went through the Bible and looked at all the genealogies that give time periods in the Bible and put those together according to each of the genealogies and kind of added up the time. And by doing that, he established that the world and the universe was created, and you can put this in there, at 4004 BC. Okay, using biblical genealogies. I'm not sure I'd do that, but that's what he did. But let me tell you, that kind of answered the question. I don't think people were real, with that more spiritual mindset, people weren't asking this hard question and wondering about where they came from. So that answer, being a simplistic answer, was one they just adopted. In fact, I can remember as a little boy picking up my mom's family Bible. And when you opened it up, it had some pictures in the beginning, just pictures of Old Testament figures. And under Adam and Eve, it had the world was created in 4004 BC. This was in the 1950s, okay? Which is interesting that even then there were not a lot of controversy around where we were and how we got here. Now all that changed, of course, in 1859 with Charles Darwin and his book, The Origin of the Species, which began to build momentum through the 1800s and into the 1900s. And then we had the great controversy of the Scopes monkey trial in 1925. Now let me just everybody, put this in perspective. 1925. Less than 100 years ago. And this growing viewpoint of evolution was taking hold of the university and the schools and stuff like that. and then it arrived in America and began to seep out into communities and came to a head in the Scopes monkey trial of 1925. And in that trial, you had a teacher, a biology teacher by the name of John Scopes. He was in Tennessee, and he started teaching his class evolution. Now, 1925, with the Butler Act in Tennessee, teaching evolution in public schools was against the law. And so he was prosecuted. And it made national headlines for weeks as this trial went on. And at the end of it, a decision was rendered, and he was found guilty of breaking the law and fined $100 and told not to do it again. Okay? It's kind of hard to believe, isn't it? And you can actually, if you ever want to watch the story of the Scopes monkey trial, it's a movie. It was a famous movie, Inherit the Wind. And you can still watch it on Netflix. But though the argument was won to keep teaching creation in our public schools, evolution really won the day through the newspapers and the headlines. Because in that trial, Christianity and the idea of the world being created in 6 days increasingly looked archaic and backwards and kind of outdated and without proof, as it had to face the opponent called science. And out of that, we had this huge turnover that then moved into the school systems in the decades that followed. So here we are in 2017, and now evolution is taught as the primary view in the public school, and it is against the law to teach creation. That's an amazing turnaround, but that happened. You know, I've got a good friend who's a very prominent theologian, Dr. Wayne Grudem, and in your outline it says this. When Wayne looks at it now from a theological viewpoint of where we are today, here's what he says. Scripture seems to suggest but not require a young earth view. In other words, when you look at the Bible, you tend to keep wanting to lean to an earlier earth, while the observable facts that come from science seems increasingly to favor an old earth view. Now, I know that kind of creates some tension in the room, but that's the world in which we live. And rather than run from it, the reason we're doing a Great Questions class is I want you to run to it and feel like, okay, I've got a framework I can operate on, and now I can actually, after we're finished with this class, I could actually investigate things and know where to hang that information rather than just have a big fog and be overwhelmed by it. That's why we're having the class. So, is our earth young or old? Two different answers. Second question, is day in Genesis 1 a literal 24-hour day, or can it mean something else? Dr. Charles Ryrie of Dallas Seminary published a very, very popular Bible called the Ryrie Study Bible. And in his notes, he points out that anytime day is used in the first 5 books of the Old Testament, but principally in Genesis with an adjective, a numerical adjective like first day or second day, anytime it's used that way, it refers to a literal 24-hour day. And using that, if you have his study Bible, he'll press for the answer that when you read Genesis, you have to believe in 6 24-hour days when God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the counter argument, and we're again just on the surface here, but the counter argument would be, well, are you just jumping to a conclusion just because you have those numbers? Can day mean something longer? And lo and behold, right in Genesis, day is used in other contexts to mean a longer period of time than just a 24-hour day. Now, it may not use the numerical adjective, but even in Genesis 2:24, when Moses is summarizing how God created, he uses the word day to summarize all the days. So day there means much longer than just one 24-hour day. It means days. And then when you read through, for instance, the 6th day of creation, when we as man was created, you come across all these things that man did in that, quote, 24-hour period. First, he was created. Then God introduces him to a garden that he's to tend and take care of. Then God brings all the animals on planet Earth to him, and he names all of them. Then he creates Eve and brings Eve to Adam so they can couple up and reproduce. And all that happens in 24 hours. Now let's just stop and think about that for a minute. Did you ever see the series 24 with Jack Bauer? Did you ever watch one of those 24 episodes and think, he couldn't have done all that in 24 hours? Okay, I just gave you the argument for the other side from the Ryrie viewpoint. Because they look at that and they would look at us, if we held to a 24-hour perspective, and say, how could Adam have possibly done all of that and experienced all of that in one 24-hour time frame? Okay, third question. How reliable are dating methods? I've listed the three primary dating methods in your notes: carbon-14, mitochondrial DNA dating, and radiometric dating. Now we're just going to touch on those just briefly, but just so you know, these are the three that we have today. There's some new advanced stuff coming out, but one of the things that happens in our world today is when you hear of some discovery found and they say it was carbon-14 dated at 1000 AD, our mindset, because we're so trusting in science, would be to say, well, that proves it. That piece of cloth or that bone or whatever is 1000 AD, because we think of science in more absolute terms of proof. But one of the things I want to tell you is each one of these dating methods is suspect to having flaws. I had the privilege of being with one of the world's great carbon-14 specialists. And we were talking about a certain artifact that was found in the 12th century and whatever. And he told me it was carbon-14 dated for that date, but he was highly suspect if that was accurate because of certain atmospheric conditions and things that had happened around that particular artifact. And he looked at me and said, you know, carbon-14 isn't perfect. Well, here's what I want you to know. I think it's our best way of measuring these three methods I've listed there, but we need to hold whatever the conclusion is loosely. And I think in the future, as new techniques come out, we're going to find that some of the things we've dated are going to be maybe a little off or substantially off. But let's just look at each one of them real quickly. On carbon-14, it dates the half-life of carbon degenerating over time in a uniform way. And what it dates is it dates materials like bone and wood and cloth. And it has an accuracy, or high accuracy, according to scientists, of 2,000 years, but it can be stretched out as far as 50,000 years. And of course, that's where some of the question marks start coming in. But that's carbon-14. Mitochondrial DNA is dating genetic material that's found within cells. And even after the organism, the living organism, has died, those genetic fragments remain and can be tested up to 100,000 years. So you know when they find mummies and stuff like that and they're trying to extract the genetic material out of those mummies, what they're trying to do is date that mummy using mitochondrial DNA. And then radiometric dating, when you ask, well, how do we know a dinosaur is 200 million years old, or what? I mean, because now we're way out and these first two wouldn't be able to date those. Radiometric dating is a technique that dates non-organic matter because of the conversion rate of the breakdown of that matter. For instance, the conversion rate of uranium into lead takes place real slowly but uniformly over millions, even billions of years. And so using rocks and conversion rates, we can quote, date things up to, get this, 48 billion years. So when somebody says a dinosaur that was found in the Arctic, you know, is 212 million years old, they're not dating the bones of the dinosaur because that's kind of past life at that point. What they're dating is the rocks that the dinosaur was encased in. And they can say, well, this dinosaur perished, you know, 200 million years ago because of this radiometric dating. So those are the three. All I want you to know is there's questions about all three as far as their absolute accuracy, but that's how we come up with things, and I think some of that will change over time. Okay, fourth, where do dinosaurs fit into history? Well, the old Earth answer is that they lived 230 million years ago based on those dating techniques, the evolutionary viewpoint that I just talked about, and then suddenly they disappeared from the earth. And of course, science is not sure why they disappeared. They talk about a cataclysmic asteroid hitting the earth and blanketing the earth, and those great mammals passed on because they couldn't handle that kind of environmental catastrophe. But that's how they would answer it. The young Earth view would be that, and that now we're talking about the Earth being 10,000 years ago. You know, you're an early Earth guy, a literal six-day Genesis guy. You would say that man and dinosaurs were created at the same time, and that Adam named the dinosaurs, and that maybe over a period of time before the flood, Noah's flood, they became extinct for some reason, because I don't think Noah brought the dinosaurs onto the ark. Okay, so maybe they perished before the flood. But that would be kind of what the early Earth answer would be in that regard. Fifth, can we date when the human race began? Well, here would be the answers of each of the views. Natural evolutionists would say that man-like creatures first appeared, man-like creatures, not us, we're evolving 2.5 million years ago. We would call them humanoids. And they evolved in Africa where they grew out of this warm environment through the family tree of our great ape ancestors. And then they evolved between 100,000 years ago, and then somewhere around 50,000 years they emerged out of Africa, enlightened, that we call human beings today. And then they immigrated all over the earth. Six-day creationists would take a much more limited view. It'd say Adam and Eve were directly created by God, maybe 8,000 to 4,000 BC. And then the earth was populated. They, again, more in the Middle East, Fertile Crescent area, and then migrated around the earth. Theistic evolutionists would say this: for thousands of years, thousands and maybe even tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of years, God perfected the animal form that ultimately became man. And he evolved to a certain shell. He was the shell of a man. He looked like us, but he wasn't truly us. And then somewhere in that evolving process, God injected his divine image into that man. And suddenly, he became thinking man and spiritual man. By the way, if you might just note in your notes there, that was C.S. Lewis's view, that's how we became who we were. And so this proto-man was endowed with the image of God at some point, maybe 50,000 years ago, and became modern man. No Adam and Eve were required in this process. And then the day-age creationists would say that Adam and Eve were directly created by God as the first couple, and we all can trace our lineage back to them somewhere between 50,000 to 8,000 BC. Okay, sixth question. How should we think about evolution? Okay, evolution involves two main things, guys. First, it involves natural selection. And that's the ability of a species to better adapt to its environment by eliminating certain features. You know, if you're a wolf and you're in the Arctic and you have gray hair and your buddy has white hair, eventually, as time goes on, all the wolves will have white, because the ones that had dark hair didn't survive because they couldn't sneak up on their enemies. Okay? Kind of works like that. But here's the thing about natural selection. Natural selection, as far as we know, never adds a new feature to an organism. It just eliminates features so they can better adapt to their environment. But that's the case for natural selection. The other thing that goes along with evolution is what we call mutation. That is, somewhere along the line, a particular species will mutate and take on new features, and at least from the evolutionary perspective, those new features will advance it into the future. Now here's the problem with mutation. Everything we know about mutation, and anything you have seen about some species or some person who has some we don't call it mutation, we call it a defect. Maybe they're born with 2 fingers, or they have a 3rd eye, or whatever. But mutations never positively advance an organism. They never positively advance an organism. They never add a feature that makes the organism better or different in the sense of advancing it. The mutation actually corrupts it, holds it back, and ultimately maybe just destroys it. It passes off the scene. And that is a big problem for the evolutionist. Because the evolutionist, and this is the word you'll hear, the evolutionist is always looking for the missing link that makes one organism change, mutate, and advance into something better or new for the future. So you've got the fish who's in the ocean and over billions of years, for whatever reason, suddenly begins to sprout wings off of its fins. And then one day lifts out of the water and becomes a bird. Now that's kind of extreme, I know. But we're talking about something like that, where there's a big leap forward. Because that's what you're doing when you pick up an article like I just showed you, and you look at something like this, and you go, this is what they're saying. They're saying what we see in these skulls, we're looking for the missing link, the mutation, where this monkey suddenly goes like this and looks different and has a different jaw and a different finger and hand network, and moves forward and becomes not a monkey but a man. And you've got to have those intermediary links in order to make evolution happen. Look at the statement by Dr. Wayne Grudem on this. He says this: the fossil record was Charles Darwin's greatest problem in 1859. He was unable to find any fossils from intermediate types to fill in the gaps between distinct kinds of animals. Darwin realized this, but thought it was due to the fact that not enough fossils had been discovered. However, the subsequent 150 years of intense archaeological activity, and by the way, it has been intense. Archaeology was very primitive 150 years ago. There are hundreds of thousands of archaeologists digging everywhere. But in that intense archaeological activity, we have still failed to produce, underline this, even one convincing example of a needed transitional type. Not even one, guys. And see, we always talk about the missing link between the ape and modern man, that we're so desperate to find out so we can prove that evolutionary process. But I want you to think of hundreds of thousands of species of all sorts. Where are their missing links? We haven't found even one. You know, Russell and I were privileged to celebrate the 150th birthday of Charles Darwin in Galapagos. We were there. And they were having a little celebration stuff, and we went around the islands and those kind of things. And let me tell you, they have their presentations that you get to experience there in the museum and the research lab that they have that they're still working in. But at the 150th birthday of Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, there were no celebrations of intermediate links. There was no one saying, we finally found one. There was nothing. It was just the same old tired arguments, because we haven't advanced it at all, really, in this particular area that's so vital to prove an evolutionary process. And this is the final question. Are Adam and Eve real people? First of all, does it matter? Well, just a few years ago, they did a big Gallup poll, and they asked Americans, does it matter how we came to live on planet Earth, where we came from? And you know what? The majority of Americans indicated it matters a great deal. Now, they may not have the discussion we're talking about today, but there's an instinct within us. There's an instinct that I'm more than just finite. I'm trying to find my connection to the eternal. How do I do that? What am I here for? Who am I? Where am I going? What's my purpose? And let me tell you, all of all of what I just said, if you pull it back, rest in how we began. And if we began through random chance in a material universe, then basically what we said, we're just a giant cosmic accident. Now we might like who we are, but we're an accident. And we have no ultimate destiny other than, like the rest of the universe, to ultimately perish. End of story. And that affects the choices I make every day of my life because there's no accountability in that cosmos. On the other hand, if in fact I was put here by God, created by God, I was probably created for a purpose. And my job is to discover that purpose and link up to it because it's not going to end when they say amen at my funeral. There's more to follow. But all of that rest in this question, does it matter? And Americans just instinctively think it matters a great deal. Here's what the experts say. Let's start with Francis Collins. Remember him? He's the guy that broke the genetic code that has the biologos theistic evolutionary viewpoint. Here's the way he answers the question about Adam and Eve. He says, unfortunately, the concept of Adam and Eve as the literal first couple and ancestors of all humans does not fit the genetic evidence. So from his standpoint, it doesn't fit. And so, because he doesn't believe Adam and Eve were real people. He believed we just evolved into the state, the worshiping, conscious image of God state that we're in. But if there were no Adam and Eve, it creates all kinds of issues. And I want to introduce you to one of the issues with John Bloom's statement in your notes. So look at your notes because this next quote is very important. If there was merely a population of pre-Adamic hominids that collectively evolved into modern man, then the theological foundation for the nuclear family and sin and death appears to be eroded. If the Bible does not correctly explain the origin of a problem, why would one trust its solution? In other words, can the Bible's theology be true if the historical events in which that theology is based are false? Now let me reduce that down in a simpler form. If there was no Adam and Eve, and if Adam and Eve weren't tempted and then chose to sin, and when they made that, sin infected the whole world, of which we're still struggling with, and that thousands of years later Jesus Christ came to solve, that's what Bloom is saying. If that didn't happen, then why do we need a Savior? Because if there was no sin from Adam and Eve, why do we need a Savior later to save us from that sin? See, if the historical facts upon which the solution is based aren't true, then the whole thing falls apart. Marriage is created in Genesis with Adam and Eve and called out to be the ultimate companionship in life. But if that really didn't happen, what is companionship? It's what we're making it today. It's anybody and everybody hooked up together based on an emotion rather than a theological, historical premise. See how all that gets wiped away if there's no Adam and Eve? That's what Bloom's saying here. Tim Keller, who's a popular theologian and pastor, says this: Paul most definitely wanted to teach us that Adam and Eve were real historical figures. If Adam doesn't exist, Paul's whole argument of sin and grace falls apart. Christianity Today did a whole magazine on it. Christianity Today is a very popular Christian magazine, and its concluding statement I thought was significant. It says, the entire story of what is wrong with the world, let's say that again, the entire story of what is wrong in the world, when you look at your iPhone today, hinges, all of it, hinges on the disobedient exercise of the will by a real Adam and Eve. So theologians would say, does it matter? They'd say, oh yeah, it really matters. But the general John and Sally Smith who are walking through Little Rock today, it matters for them too. They may not fully know it, but it matters a great deal because it tells them, am I a purposeful being or am I just a random accident? See, it means a great deal. Okay, we're going to conclude and take a little break, and then we'll come back for some questions. But let's conclude with three statements. It's important to remember that science in general is an imperfect discipline constantly updating and correcting itself. Now, in the 21st century, the new authority of life, it tends to be science. And because most of us aren't scientists, when we hear scientific conclusions, they could be from everything from dieting to when the universe began, but we tend to think of it as authoritative and without error. But I just want to remind everybody, science is an inexact discipline. It has all kinds of problems. And in light of what we're talking about today, I just want to call your attention to the fact that until the mid-20th century, listen, until the mid-20th century, scientists thought the universe was eternal. It was called the steady state theory. Existed for generations. The universe is eternal. Now, if we would have been back at the turn of the 20th century with the steady state theory, and we were in a classroom and somebody said, I thought God created the heavens and the earth, because Moses said in Genesis that the universe had a beginning. And people would laugh and say, it didn't have a beginning. It's eternal. It's always existed. It just is. But then in the mid-20th century, through, again, scientific research, which you walk around thinking this has always been the view, millennials especially, but that all changed with research. And suddenly, science threw out the steady state theory and replaced it with what? The Big Bang. And you know what's funny about that? The Big Bang, at least at one level, aligned itself with what a guy who was kind of a Bedouin shepherd, Moses, said 4,000 years ago. And that is that the universe had a beginning. Now with the Big Bang, science says the universe had a beginning. See how they align themselves? Now how they had that beginning, theologians and Moses would say it was through God. This would say by what we don't know. Stephen Hawkins would say, I don't know what it did, but it just did. But they both now align themselves because science has corrected itself. So I just want you to know, it's inexact. Secondly, there's a lot we simply don't know about creation, so we should engage the subject with continued openness and humility. You know, it was funny when I was growing up that people many times could actually break off a relationship if they didn't believe in a 6-day literal creation. Churches would break apart. It was heresy. Here's all I want you to know. I believe, I'm speaking for me, I believe that God created the heavens and the earth. How He did it, I'd be more than happy to tell you how I think He did it. And I gave you the 4 views. And I'll pick one and give you everything I think is true about my particular view. But if you picked another one, not the evolutionary one, which is godless, but one of the other 3, and said, I believe that, I'd say we just need to keep gathering information and let's be good friends and just talk about it. Now, why do I say that? Because Solomon has already told us we're not going to have it 100% nailed down. And it is not an essential to the faith. It's an elective to the faith. What's essential is that we believe God did it. And in order to make it make sense to us today, I do think we have to believe in an Adam and Eve. I do. But apart from that, we can have differences and everything's okay. And in the 21st century, with all the stuff that's breaking us apart in division, we don't need another divider. We need a uniter. And you know what the uniter is? Humility. We don't fully know, but we can know a lot. But I just want you to say, we need to have that humble state in order to move forward, not backwards. Letter C, there is a lot we do know. But here's how we know it. And we just need to admit it. We know it by faith. And so here's what we know. Adam and Eve were real people created in the image of God. And that's why we're created in the image of God. That's why we have that divine consciousness. It's not by accident. It's by a supernatural act of God to put His image within us when He created us. Secondly, Adam and Eve's fall was a real event. And it was that event that infected us all with sin. And all we have to do when we're finished today's meeting is walk out of here and, like I said, turn on the TV or look at our iPhone and you will see the effects of Adam's sin everywhere. Everywhere. We live in a fallen world. As one said that I read just last week, the 20th and 21st century, in a sense, is conquering everything. We're moving forward at lightning speed with our inventions, our innovation, our entrepreneurship, but there's one thing man can't get a grip on. He can't tackle and subdue the beast within. It's the country that cripples every man, the beast within. You go into that jungle and it eats you alive. And that's why you have to have a Savior. You have to have somebody lead you out of that world. It's not going to be science. It's going to be God Himself. And then lastly, number 3, our salvation in Christ is real. And so is our eternal destiny. So how on earth did we get here? It's a good question, isn't it? And there's different viewpoints, but we can find unity, I believe, and we can see the shortcomings of some of the other views, especially the evolutionary view, when we see it's without God, because we got here by God. And by faith, one day we'll report back to God, and He'll say to us, "Well done, my good and faithful servant."